fairly recent publication by a fellow at Southern Cal. Where is it? Southern Cal? At Berkeley. And what he does, I read about half of it, and I think it's uh, going to make a meaningful contribution to the understanding of racism. And incidentally, he'll be on Channel 2 tonight at 7:30 on a book review program. This is Winthrop D. Jordan, and he set out for himself to trace the attitudes uh, toward black people. It's called White Over Black, the title of the book, from about the 16th century until the War of 1812. What he's really discussing is the background, I think, to racism, not so much discussing black people, but things particularly English-speaking Western and Northern Europeans, giving a discussion of the forces which shaped this mentality that we've come to know as white racism or white supremacy. The interesting thing is that, and I think it's quite logical that things should be the way they are, given certain facts. I mean, it's quite logical. It's just one thing leads to another. When you understand the things that he deals with, all of these, psychological and sociological factors which had a tremendous impact on the mentality of the people. Christianity, he examines that, the rise of nationalism. I suppose it's all men have had penchant to be, ethnocentric. I think that's a natural posture of most people for various and sundry reasons. I think what you do see is that we tend to look at, without examining the undercurrents of racism, is kind of something kind of natural. It's a long time ago that people used to even say that it was decreed by God. One could even recall from reading some parts of American history that one of the defenses that Southerners offered the slaveocracy in the South for slavery was that, like it was part of their tradition, as it was with the Greeks or the Romans. That ought to be, touched upon a little bit. They used that. They pointed out that Greece and Rome were slaveocracies. So that's quite natural. There must be a position between a relationship between the superior and subordinate. You define people along racial lines. Well, this is not quite true when you examine as ethnocentric as Romans and Greeks were. Certainly was not racist. There are a whole lot of reasons for people to be ethnocentric about themselves. And when Romans and Greeks referred to people as barbarians, it's really describing cultural phenomenon rather than racial, for obvious reasons, because most of the people they had reference to in terms of the people whom they defined as barbarians were Western and Northern Europeans, the largest group of barbarians they ever came in contact with. So it couldn't be that. Now, they were extremely ethnocentric. It had a lot to do, it's a cultural factor, citizenship and all of these things. If you consider that Greece and Rome were a part of the Mediterranean communities, which included North Africa and Asia Minor, one of the most heterogeneous areas in the world even today, I mean, racially speaking, it runs the gamut from A to Z. And the same, if you examine the works of people like Pliny and Herodotus, even Aristotle, they mentioned many people who were black. It didn't have any more significance than a physical one. I'm sure that they would recognize differences between people. But it certainly didn't have any profound intellectual basis. And although most of the Greek philosophers said something about, well, not most of them, a good number of them, about what we would relate to as race, I mean, describing people physically, physical characteristics. When we talk about race and racism, you're talking about a lot of things. Basically, it's an intellectual concept in the sense that we understand race. It isn't purely physical. When one talks about race, he ascribes a number of other things that are intangible things. that defines, for instance, the way people behave. We ascribe biotic reasons. I mean, the fact that you are, and there may be something to that, but we certainly know from the study of genetics that it isn't profound. There may be some differences between people because of what we call race. But to say that a man, like people once referred to, even in this country, race, and it was happening all the time, of having some linguistic orientation. I mean, relating language to race, which is purely cultural, and the way people behave in culture is, of course, learned behavior. It's not biotic, it's not genetic, but we tend to assume that black people behave a certain way because they are black and white people behave a certain way because they are white. This is not true. I think this ought to be obvious. If it were true, then certainly black people would, still be speaking Ashanti and Yoruba and still have a lot of Africanisms about their behavior. This isn't the case. And we tend to not think of race, and race is so close to culture, we don't make a distinction between it, but there are two distinct entities, culture and race. Culture is learned, and what we call race, I suppose, is originally, when the scientists were dealing with, we were talking about the way people looked, morphology, physiognomy, the number of, Melville Herskovich studied a number of characteristics or traits, which he called racial traits. Just among many of them, 30 of the traits were skin color and hair form, but he dealt with such things as the length of the finger and the width of the hips. All of these makes up a race, and if you have a number of these characteristics in common, whatever, it depends on whatever anthropology is studying, then you're a race, But it seems there's almost too much overlapping to get for anybody to get too definitive about it, because you will find that there are contradictions in any given race or any given interbreeding group. You take the contradiction of Ethiopians or Nilotic people in general. Nilotic is term, you're talking about the cultures which grew up around the Nile. The Watuts are Nilotic people. We've seen them in the movies. So-called pure Watuts is more like white people in his morphology than he is like a black person. I mean, in terms of his long nose and mouth and the way his bone structure is. But he's black with woolly hair. And another thing about race is the thing that is fairly recent and fairly modern is the whole question of identifying people as races that are literary on the basis of just skin color or some obvious, and that's the most obvious thing we mean when we say race, black or white. The fact that white and black people are fairly recent phenomena in the sense that white people certainly are. I mean, white people were really in this country just began to refer to themselves as white people about 200 years ago. And all you have to do is study some of the logs, some of the records of the colonial Americans, and people generally refer to themselves as Englishmen or Christian in this triracial society. And even deal with the question of white. White is a fairly recent phenomenon. And it's really grows out of a kind of a self-awareness, a political self-awareness, which grew out of exploration and all these things in contact with other human groups. Because if white people had never met Indians and Africans, I mean East Indians, it's unlikely that you would ever have any white people. Because as long as people were similar, that is, racially in Northern and Western Europe, how can an Irishman, what point would it be to saying I'm white? As opposed to an Englishman, or a Swede, or a Norwegian. It has no value. It had no value until exploration. Until people begin to, most of Europe, it isn't to say that all of Europe had no contact with black people. Certainly all of the Iberian communities, the Spain, Portugal, the Italian peninsula, people who would be called white in parts of the Middle East, parts of Egypt, had seen black people since, classical history. But for the great majority of the isolated populations of Europe had had any meaningful contact with black people. And when you have particularly people like English-speaking people who were kind of latecomers to the whole thing, black people in particular, the contact with them, the first leg of it was, of course, carried out by the Spanish and Portuguese people. Like 100 years before Great Britain, English-speaking people even developed any relationship with Africans in 1631. The Spanish were already there, and there was this interchange across the Straits of Gibraltar for 100 years. We're talking about the mass of people, European people, now who slept. We're talking about the Dark Ages, who represent, people in this country represent I think, the legacy of that tradition of white folks, It's amazing to me, particularly when you come to institutions like this, how so many scholars, not all of them, miss this. It's really not that complicated to figure out, because the world that we know is not that old. You're talking about 400 or 500 years old. That's not much time in the history of man, in our at least 10,000 years of self-conscious history of human beings. 400 years is not much time, And if you can account for the things that took place in Greece and Rome 3,000 or 4,000 years ago, Egypt, I think we ought to be able to account for this 300 or 400 year travail in academic communities. I think one of the biggest, one of the most glaring, I don't want to say contradiction, I almost said indictment, I almost said crime, but really is when one examines this more and more. We've always had people like this man in Melville Herskovits in academic institutions, but how did they miss, even giving serious consideration to the black experience in this country as an academic discipline? I mean, how did they miss that? Something so important as that. Almost the whole of academia in America, except for the handful of scholars who's done this for years. There's nothing new about African studies in a real sense, or Afro-American history. It was esoteric for a long time, but it's certainly not new. It just surfaced. Melville Herskovits set up a Department of African Studies at Northwestern in 1922. Boston University has had an African Studies department for quite a long time, but these were just individual people. But in the main, the academia never, seriously considered the experience of black people worthy of academic pursuit. It's very interesting. It's clear because the only thing that they missed. It's the only thing, the only experience about what happened in America. By extension, you're talking about other people. But something as big as, say, the slave trade, 400 years, involved all of modern Europe. All of Europe except for Italy and the Russians and the Poles. The Slovak people. All of Europe was involved in that. Inextricably interwoven with the development of black people, and we miss that experience, That, is a glaring example, I'd like to say, of maybe a form of racism. And we're dealing primarily with racism primarily as an institutionalized phenomenon, basically institutional in the sense that we understand what institutions are and how people relate to them. And we tried to examine the political structure of this country and how people relate to them, how they express themselves. We know that politics is a relationship between the ruling and the ruled. And anybody's government, any government can do one of two things. It either helps people do what they want to do or keep people from doing what they want to do. That's all. That's the only function of government, as I can see. Helps you do what you want to do. In terms of land, in terms of organization, or it stops you. They're either oppressive or they are pro-human governments in the eyes of whatever people relate to them. We still have that today. We have a free world and communist world. Presumably the communist world keeps people from doing what they want to do, and the free world allows people to do what they want to do. Well, you can see a glaring contradiction, and the basis of the politics of this country was distinctively racist, I advance it, therefore, as a suspicion only that blacks, whether originally a distinct race or made distinct by time and circumstance, are inferior to whites in the endowment of body and of mind. It's Thomas Jefferson from his Notes on Virginia. That's kind of his autobiography. That's just one of many statements that Jefferson made. He ran into a lot of trouble about that from other people like Dr. Samuel Johnson, who answered him. You know, he talked about the rights of man, and he said that's a real interesting thing that those who talk about the rights of man are themselves drivers of Negroes. You know, Jefferson, better than any one I can point to, because for me, stand out as what I call a white racist. You see, it just isn't something as simple as discrimination and prejudice. See, white racist. This is one of the great. He was an intellectual, no question about it. One of the great minds this country ever produced. But he, like, you know, and we see that race later on is a cultural phenomenon. You know, that any individual is a product of his culture. So he was racist, and he acknowledged it. You know, one of the experiences I remember about Jefferson when he was talking about black people, he did a whole thing on his Notes on Virginia. He's talking about he's a characteristically honest man. Like, the racism in him was not apparently, and many of the founders, was something that they consciously defended, like people do today. It just is, man. It's natural. I have no evidence, no contradictory evidence. Is what I never saw a black man whom I saw could master Euclidean theory or higher geometry. And when Jefferson said that, he said that, like, this year, in about 2 years, after he said it, a black man named Benjamin Banneker put together America's first workable clock. He predicted the eclipse of the sun to the exact second, put together the first widely read almanac, you know, did a very good study of the bees, a lot of things. Scientist, mechanic, a philosopher, mathematician, and astronomer. And Jefferson heard about him, and it blew his mind. He couldn't believe it. So he made friends with him, you know, with Benjamin Banneker. That's really how Banneker, you know, and they became great pen pals. And when Jefferson was talking about the intellectual development of this country with his French buddy Condorcet, Banneker was one of the men he mentioned as one of the brightest, you know, minds on the horizon in this country. Not even, you know, but yet, that's easy for him. He saw him as an exception, not even probably seen him as a black man, you know. And that's how Banneker became involved in designing the city of Washington and these kinds of things. But he was still racist, you know. And I think people do that today. Some people could, many, because racism is an impersonal phenomenon. Number one, I think it's possible for a racist person, white person, to have a very good black friend. On an individual. I think that sounds like a contradiction, because they don't assert, they're saying Joe, you know, I know Joe, you know, but that ain't got nothing to do with it. Individualism, it is an impersonal, almost non-human thing that you just take for granted. It's a concept that you apply to groups of people and stereotype individuality. Stereotype destroys individuality among people, and you can find it right in this country today. People like Thomas Jefferson could really admire something about a black person as an individual, but never as a group. You know, they're just, as a group, they're inferior. People, all of these people. Pat Henry had some problems with that, some real problems. I can't justify it, you know. Just ain't right, but what I'm gonna do, you know, because I got like 27 slaves, and that's, you know, the only thing I know. That's the basis of my economic existence. Yes.
You know, this is one of the problems today in understanding the complexity of the Black Revolution. Certain kinds of militant actions on the part of blacks, like the occupation buildings or holding the guns over the administrators at Cornell, and they jumped to the conclusion that this is the Black Revolution.
Yeah, yeah.
Now, could you clear the air on this difficulty that people have in understanding the total complexity of what's going on?
Well, I think that
one fringe element.
Yeah, right. Black people, by and large, I don't, you know, whether you're NAACP or Muslim or Black Panther or politically conservative, however, I think all blacks represent a set of reactions to white racism. That's my definition for it. That's the motion. That's the motion of the guns, whether you threw a gun or a brick, or whether you march or sing or whatnot. It's a reaction to white racism. And we don't know ourselves. I think it's up to newspapers and whatnot to pick out what is the essence of so-called the Black Revolution. But newspapers, more than any since they've covered so many, ought to know better that revolutions are multifaceted. And I think the gun, the symbol of the gun, is legitimate as somebody singing or marching. These are all possibilities in a revolution. But it's not the essence of it, And I think in terms of what I understand, I have a friend who's at Cornell right now, Don Lee, who's an artist in residence. And from what I understand through the grapevine, that if I were there, I would have probably had me a gun if I were with them. Because black people, see, they feel they can predict white behavior. Like people saying, we're going to do this, we're going to do that if you take over the building. So they made sure that they were going to, take the building. If somebody came to get them, they would, stop them. I mean, we had the same thing out at Moral Hall. There were a bunch of people out there who were going to come in, and break it up, see, violently. And they were going to stop them. So I would certainly agree with that, but that's that they should, because white behavior is pretty predictable. It don't take much to make white folks violent, That's just one minor facet. I think it's as real as Abernathy and them singing in Charleston right now. It's a legitimate part of it. I'm not hung up about violence. That means that I don't think any human being basically loves violence. I don't think man is basically violent any more than he is non-violent. I think these are extremes of, it depends on circumstances, conditions, and whatnot, but certainly man is violent. As violent as he is non-violent, And I think extreme aggression is unnatural, and in the same sense that non-violence is unnatural. I think the most natural posture is an amoral one, that's of self-defense. I just think that's natural for people. I don't care whether you're black or white, but I don't think it's natural for you to be extremely aggressive. That's the thing that I view whites as extreme. That's as extreme as Martin Luther King's posture. As the posture of white people in their relationships to black people is extreme aggression. That's unnatural, And I think it's somewhere in between. But we know this is one of the best examples. Our country, in our experience here, is one of the best examples you can point to in the history of the world of people having a violent prone to be more violent than non-violent. I think the record speaks for itself.
Yeah, maybe I'll throw a barb into what you're saying here.
Yeah.
But I think, I'm quoting or paraphrasing Thomas Jefferson.
Yeah.
People who are oppressed have the right to revolt, one. And two, can you reflect upon institutional racism is concerned with a person who is applying for or is a conscientious objector to the draft on both religious or constitutional grounds?
Well, I think the draft, my own position is draft, I'm opposed to it. I think people should have the right, this is a kind of a moral question, the whole question of draft, to resist the draft. I don't think that anybody should be forced. I think there's some provision for, ruling out involuntary servitude, which is what I primarily view the draft as. It's involuntary servitude. There are a lot of contradictions. I think that you got enough people in this country. I think you could have armies, without draft. As much as folks in this country love to fight and love wars, we have a tradition in that. We might even do it like they used to do it in the Roman days, where they used to have demonstration wars. Folks who wanted to go fight, just let them out there. Let them do their thing, if that's their nature. I have my own position on the draft, is that it's a kind of a moral thing that I think a person has a right to resist, and they should resist. Particularly at this time, with all these contradictions. I think that people who resist the draft could do a great service to America in terms of helping her to understand herself and what she's involved into. She hasn't always had a draft, Up until the Civil War, you had, like voluntary armies, and you made out pretty good. And it just stuck after the Civil War. And probably had it not been a Civil War, you probably wouldn't have had the draft to this day. I don't know that.
We haven't had a peacetime draft before the end of the Second World War.
Right.
Wartime draft until then, but
Right.
peacetime only from 45 on.
Right, right, that's right, that's right. And I think it's, well, I'm opposed to that kind of draft. And I have no solution. I haven't thought about it that much. Except that I think you got enough folks who like to fight, who like adventure and whatnot. Let them do that. A lot of people have hang-ups about their masculinity. They associate masculinity with violence and this. I think you have a lot of people like that in America. You know, well, every color who dig that. You know, that's it. Crumbs. So they give them a lot of money. You know, whatever they dig, and let them go ahead and fight. If we must have an army. But I don't think people who are opposed to violence on some moral grounds or whatever should be forced to kill other people, other Christians, Catholics, Vietnam. It's contradiction. It makes sense. So, it makes religion look real bad, too. People who profess to be religious in this country, because a whole lot of them folks are their brothers, Catholic brothers. How they all men of one blood of one nation, St. Paul. It's contradiction, man. And that's, draft resistance, a whole ball of wax, I think is part and parcel of the same, fabric that we see. These contradictions, I think black people are the essence of the contradiction. The essence of the basic contradiction facing America, of course, as I pointed out before, is the contradiction between her professed ideals and practical reality, a pragmatic reality. That's it. Jefferson saw that. See? He commented on that. He pointed out that he said that, I believe that slavery is an exercise of the most boisterous passions of one unremitting degradation on the one hand and degrading submissions on the other. It teaches white children to be tyrants after the pattern of their parents. It robs the white man of the will to work, and above all, it robs man of God's greatest gift, the gift of liberty. Indeed, I tremble for my countrymen when I reflect that God is just and that his justice cannot sleep forever. Now, out of that, you can see he was fairly consistent about that because he was the leader of the fight to have slavery abolished, that is, in terms of bringing Africans into the country by 1808. That was the first great compromise and the first, but he saw that contradiction, and many Americans did. Certainly John Adams' wife did, Abigail, who wrote him a series of letters commenting on the fact that it's contradictory that we ourselves should be fighting for what we are daily robbing and denying others from, who have as good a right to freedom as we have. The elections to Tocqueville saw it. Just many people commented on that. James Otis, the first theorist of the American Revolution, saw it. Isaac Scullman, on his Orations on the Beauty of Liberty, saw that contradiction. America's ideal, that's the basic problem. See, and it kept America, for instance, from doing what other countries did when the slavery was abolished in the last part of the 19th century throughout the world as an institution. She never came up with any answers as to what to do with the slaves. That's the problem. They never, like Russia, land reform, or even Cuba, and they freed their slaves after America. There never was any answer. You see, just limbo. She never did anything about it, just free overnight and did nothing. That is the problem. The central problem facing black people, of course, out of this is, this marginal existence is the whole question of assimilation or resistance. That's the tension of opposites of black experience in this country. That's the thing that black people are caught up on. It's nothing new about black people not wanting to be white. That's old, as David Walker, or as John S. Rock, as Martin Delany. Martin Delany was a Harvard-trained surgeon. John S. Rock was a lawyer and a doctor before the Civil War. Very well-educated men. They were what we would call black nationalists today. Black nationalists. They meant to believe in the concept of nationhood among black people. And they believed in black affirmation, So that's always been there, that concept of resistance. But the dominant theme has been one of assimilationist, or what we call integration. And that is, these are the alternatives for black people. Well, not the only. This is what has been offered. There are a lot of other alternatives, that you could deal with. But basically, this is the theme of the black experience, and it's assimilation and resistance. That's it. America's problem is the conflict of white America, or the government more particular, or the controllers of the political economy, or now the industrial complex. It's shifted. But that's the question they have to answer. They never answered it. Almost every other civilized slave nation answered that question. What do you do with your slaves after you kill them? You give them land, you pay them off, you do, something. You don't hang them there in limbo. That's the question. That's why, things like, and I wanted to say something about this, and while we're talking about it, integration, separation, put all these new de facto segregation. These are superfluous. These are not. They don't deal with symbols. They don't deal with substance. That has nothing to do with the fundamental identity of the problem in this country. It's not quite to deal with effects, results, not causes. Integration and segregation are not real entities in the sense that that white people normally understand solving problems. This is nonsense. It's still a question of power. Carmichael was absolutely right. You can't deal with it no other way. We talk about it superficially because through integration, you have the theme of assimilationism and really the perpetuation of white supremacy. That's what integration implies, whether the people mean that or not. That's the result of it. It perpetuates the same relationship, because when people generally define integration, they define it one-dimensional. Most people mean one-dimensional. Mean black people moving into white neighborhoods, going to white schools, going where the good people are, and doing as much as you can to destroy anything related to your experience. This is unheard of among any. That's not integration. Integration has to be reciprocal. And a lot of people think integration means something just social, But I think it has to be reciprocal. I think, if you're really talking about white, and maybe only people who are not white can see this, the white people have some shortcomings. That's right. And they could benefit from reciprocity with other people. Well, they always have, but I mean in a legitimate way. So you talk about integration, and so we say things like busing, and people are all upset over that. Well, I wouldn't be opposed to busing if you had white children coming out of Beverly Hills into Watts, or Long Island into Harlem, or Medina, where I live. There's nothing wrong with it. I think that's good cultural reciprocity. As long as you're going to make it one-dimensional, say, now what we're going to take is 2% of these kids and bust them out there. Now the problem's supposed to be that black people have inferior education. You're going to take the 2% and let the 98% suffer. Don't make sense. Wait, one by one, integrate that. It's impractical. It's just unrealistic. It is not beneficial. It doesn't do anything for the basic problem. If the basic problem is a problem that you could talking about doing the greatest good for the greatest number of people, it doesn't affect the lives of most black children. This is my basic opposition to busing. Not because people have always, I bust the school. People in Alabama bust the school. George Wallace, they bust black children live right around him. Is capital, and they bus past the white school to the black, school 20 miles away. There's nothing new about busing. Particularly if you're talking about children on the high school level, I don't see where it's even an argument, where they enjoy some kind of mobility anyway. It doesn't matter where you go to high school. Not really, I don't even think that's necessary. When you talk about teenagers. But at that age, during the formative years, I think that neighborhood and this kind of thing is very important. White people have a good argument for the wrong reason, of course. But that's a good argument. I'm in favor of neighborhood schools. I don't want to see them tear any more neighborhood schools down in black communities. I'm saying you can have all these things simultaneously if you're trying to deal with the problem. But the way integration has been defined, it implies to me, and I think a number of people, the perpetuation of white supremacy. Because it tells me, and it's an assault on the sensibilities of certain black people. But don't see that. Don't see that them having all the weaknesses. We think that it's a two-way street. And it's as far as we know, there are no superhumans. Then there must be something wrong with other folks too. You know, that's an argument. You know, if it's integration. You know,
Do you think part of the same mentality of words like the disadvantaged, poor?
Well, these are euphemisms.
Huh?
These are euphemisms, racist euphemisms.
Or
Sure.
the culturally deprived
Mhm.
is another extension of that white.
Yes, to fail to deal with the basic question, you redefine old problems.
Because people know what you mean when
Sure,
you
when you say
words.
culturally deprived, you mean you're not white. Whatever, you basically black people, but you're talking about Indians and other people. But basically, you're not really referring to those 35 million white people who live in this country, because most people don't acknowledge their existence, you know, until very recently. Who are, in the sense that you call black people being deprived, I mean poor physically, they're poor too. But they're also white, and it's a racist, culturally deprived, you know, disadvantaged. We're the first group of people in the history of the world to be deprived of culture, incidentally, black people. It's a euphemism for race. All these things the sociologists built up. De facto, de jure segregation. You know, segregation is there's only one definition for segregation. You know, think the man who said a long time ago, he said that he was talking about how people take words, and I've went into this before about take words which grow out of an experience, see? One word, and that word becomes a part of the vocabulary, and you take that word and apply it to a lot of things that have no relationship to experience, like segregation, you see. You know, segregation grows out of a sensuous experience that people live. Segregation was a de jure system of government which replaced the slaveocracy in the South. Before that, there was no segregation. There was no need for it. You understood the caste system. Negroes were slaves. You didn't have to say segregation. They made it after freedom segregation. The system of institutionalized system of defining human relations, everything with people, like economic relations and whatnot. That's what it has been, always, you see. Segregation was legal, de jure. It was practiced by governors and senators, you know, people who led the country. Now, black students who, if some black students on this campus wanted to move to themselves, that ain't what you're talking about. I don't know what the name you would call it, but it wouldn't be segregation, because segregation is imposed from without. It's imposed both on black people and white people. It's not self-imposed. Black people didn't segregate themselves. That's a totally different question. I don't know why people like Mr. Wilkins can't, you know, articulate that a little better. That just ain't the same. Maybe it is bad. I don't know. But the point is that, you know, don't confuse that with what we have always called segregation or racism. You know.
How would you make a distinction between what the word you use, resistance against integration? I think I understand what you mean by that. You also hear the word separatism.
Yeah, I was coming to that.
Is that a slight difference
It's
there?
another jive word. You know, I can't define it when you place it on black people. I can, you know, I know what separatists mean. I've understood, you know, separatist movements, religious separatist movements, you know, all kinds of one group of people separating and moving away from the other, either for political or economic, any reason. And we're all, you know, we've gone through separatist movement for the past 400 or 500 years. Separatist movement, the thing in Canada with the French and the British people, you know. Black people, on the other hand, you know, like, since we don't have a culture or anything like that, it'd be hard to even define. But the point is that whatever, you know, like separation is just an argument. It does make sense when it applies to black people. When the implication is, you see, that separation is bad. Okay, we'll dig that. But the people who are responsible for the separation in this country right now, it's supposed to be black people. See, that's what separation is. The people who really caused this and brought this word to the fore are black folks, wherever they are. And what they did is call attention to a reality that already exists. When you talk about people separating from one another, insofar as blacks and whites have lived together, there's always been white people moving away from black people on every walk of life. And it seems to me all that black people have said is, you know, well, you know, forget it. We'll just stop here, and instead of chasing around and playing merry-go-round. We'll just stop in and see what we can take care of business right here. That's just simple as I can put it, And people are saying it's bad now. And it seems like when we get ready to make words bad, the black people are hung up with them. Racism is another word. As I'm sure you know now, those of you who have come to more than two of these things, what I mean by racism. I certainly don't mean discrimination and prejudice. That's a part of it, but that's a very minor part of what I understand racism to mean. And I think racism is a profound ideology. It's like a religion. It's a philosophy. It's pervasive. It's deeply ingrained. And few of us have ever been able to escape it in this society. We live in a race-ridden society, period. We live in a racist condition, period. And the ingredients which make it up is a long story of institutionalized phenomena built up over the past 300 or 400 years, of mythology. Most of what people really think is real about black people are not real. It grows out of most of what, because if you examine black people from what most people know, there's no complexity to their experience. There isn't any complexity. There isn't the integrated life experience. Whether you're poor or rich or whatever society, you have an integrated life experience. That is, a man endures, he has to deal with poverty and pain and some glory and shame and all these things. Black people have been very much, involved in that. That's their whole experience. It's struggle. It's the history of black people. It's a history of strife. And the condition is the same, but there have been many, many adjustments, many radical adjustments in black people's lives. I mean, overnight. We tend to, just reduce racism now to somebody who don't like somebody because they're a different color. Well, let me assure you, that wouldn't be any problem for me to handle people personally. I mean, if some guy, because he's white, I don't like you. I know a lot of black people don't like me. That doesn't affect me. It can't do anything to me. And an individual say, well, I don't like you. Can't affect my life. But what racism does count, if this man is the president of the United States, I don't like you, and the governor controls the institutions, then it's serious. That's racism, right? He can keep me from making a living, keep my child from growing up, keep me from going to school, Who could care less? Somebody can care if white folks, which individuals don't like them. That ain't what racism is all about. I cannot like you, and it not affect you one bit. Just stay away from the people who don't like you. Go with the people who like you. It's profound, and I think that they're trying to redefine the word racism, to make it mean something else. Lamentable has been the confusion and the darkness. This is what Jeremiah Bentham said. When we, the darkness and confusion produces chaos. When we take the names of the fictitious for the names of real entities, the names of fictitious things for the names of real sensuous experience, names and things must mean something. And the name of the thing is determined by the experience to which it points. It's referent. It has to point to an experience. When I call people racist, there's a sensuous experience behind it. I'm saying it's this, it's that, it's that, it's that. It's not you don't like me. I'm talking about a whole thing. To say somebody, like Stokely Carmichael is a racist is almost humorous. It's ridiculous. Racist point of view, okay. And this is natural, logical, because we live in a race-ridden society. Like the only basis of any kind of meaningful existence black people have, say as Negroes, that's a racial nomenclature. Obviously, you can't form coalitions like white people in various walks of life. So, you have to be racist in that sense. That doesn't mean there's any philosophy behind it, or any hierarchy, or you define places for the varieties of mankind to exist, that you see yourself in a system of relations with others revolving around you, and you in the center, of everything. That just ain't racist. It just don't make sense to apply that term to people like that. Because in that case, most black folks are racist. In the sense that newscasters find, I think the Elks are racist. Black Elks, Masons, they black. The who are Black Baptists, black. If it, all the black churchmen, the Globetrotter, they're racist. In that sense, you do things together, you do something black, separate. You talk from a black point of view, then you're automatically racist. Now, first of all, black people are more, they're not a race in a real sense. An ethnic group is, I think, the more realistic term to apply to people who are called Negroes. It's ethnic rather than racial. Certainly don't fit any biological description of race. We don't have any frame of reference, any sensuous experience except reaction to racism. And what happens is you take the names, the apparent for the real. If a guy comes, talking about, black power, then that's supposed to be the answer to the Ku Klux Klan. I don't think that's true. Because when you ask me what the Ku Klux Klan is all about, I can point to something. What is that, something. Not just imagine that this is what they are, This is a real problem. All these words, racism is not well understood in this country. The definition of it, I think it's a term that certainly is going to be like a newspaper. And I think the people who are going to define the racism are newspaper people. They define everything else. They define black power, or misdefine it, I'm sorry.
How do you define it?
Black power, you take power like anybody else exercises and give it to black people. It's power, that's all it is. There are some aesthetic things, and like every other people, I think it's philosophical. I think black power presupposes this philosophy to be pro-life and pro-human. If you want to get philosophical about it, but that's all it is. I think presidents and senators understand that. I really do. I think political scientists at Harvard understand what power, no matter who's exercising, whether they're Ho Chi Minh or whoever, they know what power is. It's universal. At no point you ask me what is black power when Floyd McKissick says it. You know what black means. All right, define that without it being an adjectival noun, kind of. Now define power. Well, there you have it. You know what black is, man. You know what power is. You know how you would exercise power. You know what the word means according to Webster: the ability to act, the ability to do, the ability to influence, the ability to negate, to move. To automate yourself. It's power. Power is life. It's no mystery. But again, black people, I think, because of racist definitions, and I think this is true, part of being black in this country, and I think the essence of racism, is a disbelief, really, in the essential dignity and humanness of other people, not like yourself. It's a disbelief in the humanness of black people. It's essential humanity. Just can't believe you're talking about power. You're not supposed to deal with power. That's for people, not for you. And that's a definition of what slavery, of course, meant: loss of humanity. That's what slavery. That's why you find so many people resist the term Negro. That's what it is. It implies loss of humanity. There has never been any Negroes before or since in the world. There's no historic definition for them. That experience. So that's what it means. And that's slavery. Slavery, what makes slavery in this country unique from even slavery in Asia and Africa and Europe, is that it was the whole question of loss of the human personality. Total destruction of the human personality, as opposed to the way there are no provisions in certainly common law in England or civil law for what existed here. Slavery meant you possessed the man's labor, not his person, his labor. The same is true in Africa. It always had to, you possess his labor. Same as the children of Egypt. You own whatever he's productive at. But not him. You can't tell him he don't have the right to imagine, the right to aspire to learning, to aspire to achievement. All of these human things were denied like people. See, and that's still with us. That grows out of racism. So people are astounded that black people want power. Why should you want power? It's a very bad thing for you to have. It's not. And if there is any solution, I always say the solution is because if I understand, what I've been taught and what little I've been able to learn on my own about human beings and political questions, they're solved. They're power equations. I mean, if you don't have some kind of shared power relationship, you're going to always have problems. The experience in this country tells us that with people in the labor movement, the winning of the West, all that. They got power, they have the ability to act and to exercise and to be a part of the shaping and making of things, to influence the laws that govern them and this kind of thing. The problem disappeared. That's the problem of power relationships. It's the same problem facing black people. And not integration and separation. And integration doesn't have a darn thing to do with poor schools and poor neighborhoods and dirt roads in Mississippi. Doesn't have anything to do with that. People don't live that way because they're not integrated, it's because they don't have power to do anything about their condition. Now, we see these questions being answered, And the people who answer these questions, are really people like Fannie Lou Hamer. When the sophisticated cats like Carmichael and those went down there talking about the theories of politics and participatory democracy, and we've got to do this and we've got to do that. And they told them, no, that ain't what you got to do. What we need is the vote here. This is our problem right here in the rural South. The way you get rid of police brutality, if you get enough votes to elect the black sheriff, somebody who knows how it feels to get hit upside the head, we'll stop it. Power. Elect a tax assessor, and then we can get garbage collection, paved streets, and all these things. It's very simple, You have somebody to act who's responsible to you. Say, okay, we put you in, just like other people do. All right, you do what we say do. We're your constituency.
How's it going to work in Minneapolis with only 3%?
I think it's a little more difficult. I think, first of all, I don't think that, it's wrong for white people to run everything in Minnesota. Represent. I think that's natural. I think the white folks should be the governors and the mayors and, this statistical probability. But that doesn't preclude my running and being involved in these things and trying to influence.
It doesn't preclude a white person who thinks in terms of the black constituency or poor people who need.
No. I think we're talking about, idealistically, you need somebody to represent your interests. But I mean, the surest way for people to do it in Mississippi, to get a black person. There are no white people.
What about someone like Stokes or Hatcher? Don't you call that an example of black power?
No, I would not. I think that Stokes and Hatcher represent traditional politics. They're not innovative politicians. They haven't created anything new, and I think they're going to make good politicians in the sense that you define white politicians. They'd probably be a lot more responsible than white politicians in certain areas, I think, to the total community.
What about Powell?
I think Powell is perhaps one of the most responsible politicians, in terms of what we understand in this country to his constituents. There's no question about it. If you call people like the senators from Georgia, Mississippi, and Alabama responsible, he's responsible. He knows who elects him, people from Harlem. He fights for their interests. That's a given. That's a fact among them. You don't even question that. I think he's a good, astute politician, a good politician, and an American politician. I don't think anything is unique about it except that he's black, that he's behaving that way, and he does it with a lot of style. He makes people mad. But I don't see, he's a good in the context of the way we define American politicians. I think he's good. Johnson said it, This is the leader of the Senate said it, you respond 65 pieces of legislation when he was the head of the Labor and Education Committee. More progressive legislation than any chairman in history. They were commending him for a while.
But he's been a strong civil writer up until 1965.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he can work in coalitions. Now, does black power exclude coalition politics in your things?
Not as I understand it. Of course, when I deal with black power, I can only deal with it philosophically. I can't, because it means many things to many different people. But I think that philosophically, you can define black power where anybody could relate to it. But it means many different things. Some people say green power. I don't know what that means. Polka dot power. strife with
But
power.
somebody, it has been defined as some kind of exclusive kind of separate political action. This would lead to powerlessness in many parts of the country.
I would think so.
I see the uniting of the Black Panther Party in California with the Peace and Freedom Party as a smart
Good.
political strategy.
Right. No, I think politically black power has to be fluid. I don't even think, no matter how much they talk, that it can't be viable if it's not fluid. You know, people can talk about exclusiveness, but it just ain't going to work. You know.
Well, Carmichael talks about it in most terms in the South.
Yeah, well, I think you can do it in the South, but he talks about coalitions with white people. Yeah, in his book, I would think that this is basically where Panthers got some of the ideas about coalition from Carmichael. But I don't think coalitions don't make sense in Lowndes County, Alabama, where the population is 5 to 1 black. It's not even necessary. You know, it's not even necessary any more than it's necessary here in a place like Minnesota. It's just natural those people should have more to say in government about their lives. It's just not even debatable. And about 80 families live on 85% of the land. You know, it's weird. Can control the whole thing. So I think, I was talking about I think the current misdefinitions of, and it's creating more problems of words, of things that grew up historically. We have a whole problem of definition in this country, a whole definition game, and I think that's very crucial for people to understand the meaning of definitions. Certain people will always misdefine things. It's not unlike looking at an accident. This is kind of honest. When you and I look at an accident, we don't see it the same way, But I think in the political arena, this is a very old game going back to Machiavelli's day, that you consciously misdefine problems. When you talk about problems, these people, particularly politicians, when they use words, I get a chance to question them. I want to know, okay, give me some experience, tell me the reality. Don't just say ghost, show me the ghost, the dragon. Don't say that. Make it real, because they throw words like that around. Now we're talking about, nobody's worrying about real racism in this country yet. And as long as you focus on black people, that's what racism is supposed to be now. It's supposed to be a phenomenon such as black racism. So everybody worry about the black race, and not real people who understand philosophically what racism is, how to use it. Nobody pays much attention to certain groups of people in this country. Just a tiny group of people. Everybody is concerned about them, and other people are able to do what they want to do, organize, without any problem. No disruption. I mean, real racists. Racists can get on radio 24 hours a day and preach the subtleties of racism, and nobody ever questions it. But, yeah. Well, I think he's a racist. I've told him that to his face. He says he isn't. But every other word, his racist, he says crazy things, like, I believe that everybody should be free and but I don't think you should have the right to move next door to me, How could you say that, He says he's not racist. Yeah. That's what I mean. He is a racist, and you don't believe he is.
How do you see that as breaking down these barriers within the present confines of our structure?
Well, I don't.
We can't stay in this.
No, dead center. I think the only way to do it is the way people are trying to do it now. First of all, you have to look at the situation and try to redefine some things, and begin to condemn some things. You just don't deal with the contradiction, and it's going to, it will get very dangerous. I think that, one of two things can happen. I think that many people wouldn't mind living in a fascist state if the trouble would go away. I think that many people would accept that. Yeah, right. Would accept Germany. Just if we could just keep it out of my hair. Just don't bother me with it. That's the attitude of many people. I think that On the other hand, I think we've developed some wise leadership in this country and understand the international implications of this kind of thing, you know, and it may not be any cure for racism. That's a fact too. If it's indeed an illness, there may not be any cure for it. This may be the demise of this country, as we think of the American dream and this kind of thing of a continuous, viable, growing kind of thing. This may be the end of it, but this question has to be answered very shortly.
What about Nixon's theories or administration theories on black capitalism as an answer to this?
No, that's no answer. Not for black people. Capitalism, I don't even think capitalism is a reality in the sense that this is a mixed economy in the first place. It's not purely capitalistic. It would be tragic for black people to just accept capitalism, given their experience with capitalism. I think that whatever kind of ism it is, it has to be the kind of ism that does the greatest good for the greatest number of people. Whatever that turns out to be. And I think, again, that has to come out of people's experience. I don't think you can conceptualize everything and impose it on people. And I think it would be a very bad thing for people. I know that many black people, perhaps most black people, are capitalistic. A great majority, without even saying that they are, because obviously they're like most Americans. They don't see anything wrong with that. Yeah.
Well, I think you're saying then that a lot of the structure has to go, which I think maybe is true.
Well, the structure, this structure, well, let's put it this way. Things will never be the same, one way or the other. I think that things will get worse, considerably worse.
How would you replace capitalism?
I'm not sure. I would say I'm not an ism-oriented person. I'm not too much hung up on things like what Karl Marx. I don't think people like that are gods and whatnot. As a matter of fact, I don't think Karl Marx was that much of a genius. I really don't. I think he just discovered something which already existed and put it in a Western context. I mean, probably nobody else could conceive of communism but a Western mentality. But what he's talking about but the extension of communalism. That's all he's talking about, how wealth and African people and Asiatic people have lived like that for centuries without conceptualizing it. But in terms of a genius idea for a Western man to think of forms of communalism, forms of people owning wealth, and there's nothing new about that. I don't think there has to be any kind of traditional ism. I think that's the uniqueness of black people. It's not totally related to what has gone on before. We don't have any models to point to about a people in this kind of predicament, certainly in the revolutionary sense. There's just never been any revolution like this. There's nothing. There's too many new things. Revolutions historically have been over land, independence, You can't say that's the situation here. It's mostly social, more than anything else. It's mostly social, So it's, I don't have these kind of answers, I just know that whatever comes out of our experience should dictate how you form and develop institutions. I think that happened naturally. I think that institutions right now, for better or worse, are changing right now because they're obsolete, a lot of them. Like the church, I think it's basically obsolete in terms of attending to man's spiritual needs. If indeed they ever, attend to the spiritual needs of man, but I think it's just obsolete. And social forces tend to outlive obsolete institutions. You just do it anyway, Go into some other form of chaos.
Institutions are so slow.
Right, they're always a social lag, people And it's extremely difficult in this kind of country where you have so much technological advancement that influences the lifestyle of people. And institutions can never keep up with that, really, but they could probably close the gap. And I think it's natural for people to resist change. That's human, to resist change. Nobody ever does, taking previously unrelated things and creating new forms. That's left to the creative nerve. Yeah. Like people always, they use these things, like they say, well, a silent majority. And the good Americans and the nice Americans, that's nothing. You don't expect the good Americans and the silent majority to do anything. The lopsided majority never did anything. Well, that's true. History. They've never been in the vanguard. There have always been people who have been able to see things differently and willing to take the kinds of risk, to create new things. And then the majority comes waving the flags, after, all the spade work has been done. That's, huh?
When everything's over.
Yeah, that's the history of man. That's the history of Christianity, man. You talk about Christianity, what are you talking about? A handful of people, the Christian movement. Look at the hell even Paul had, organizing a church, forcing people, the majority of Europeans to dig Christ. When they found something they could plug into, they went on and, did their thing, the Crusades and everything else. Now we got a whole thing, so I'm not, I believe in a creative minority. I believe that's what moves and shakes the world. It certainly moves and shakes this country. And it doesn't bother me a bit that folks say, well, the majority of black folks don't feel like, well, no deal. I can understand that. The majority of white people don't feel that with us. Deal. Majority of people just kind of want to hang in there. Just like the old guy 4,000 years ago with his patch and his, when man became domesticated. That's all he was doing. Damn the politics, damn it, just let me have my patch. Damn the something, let me have my crabgrass, or let me worry about that. Well, that's the majority, And you don't expect them to do anything until after it's all over, and there's some kind of order that they can plug into, and they'll come waving the flags for you. Tell you how it was really done.
I think a good example of what you're saying in terms of recent history is the change of attitudes towards Vietnam. Now everybody says that's.
Yeah, the guys got kept out of the Senate for it.
Say that, he would have been,
sentence of 109. Everybody, Julian Bond, who'll be here next week. Was the first Republican to make pronouncements. He couldn't get his seat. But he came out and said it, It was unpopular then. I hate to think what would have happened to America if those 300,000 people who took up arms, minority, decided to go along with the majority. He said, no. In Canada. That's all for the American Revolution. Third of the people. Handful. 4 million people, 300,000 out of 4 million, and a substantial number of them were black and Indian. Lest we forget. And a lot of people agreed with the Canadians. No, we'll work it out within the British Empire. Brother John Adams, they had a hard time convincing him to become a revolutionary. It's impossible. You go up against Great Britain? Are you crazy? The sun never sets on Britain. You fools, you radicals, you Whigs, you wild. People down in South Carolina walking around business schools up in New England. Same, nothing new. The more things change, the more they remain the same. So it doesn't bother me when people always say, well, your views are very minuscule. I can dig that, It tells me something. Because I don't have that much faith in the majority. I just put the majority down. I just think most people like to be as comfortable as they can. They don't like to be disturbed. That's human whether you are in any society. Folks just don't want to be disturbed. Who likes disruption? Until you create forces in the society who understand enough about it and willing to do something about it, then you can't have newness, and you can't have creativity. You can't have viability and growth and change. That's stagnation when you say, I want to be just like my grandfather. No, just like you are. Now look at how silly that is. I was talking to a judge the other day. It was very interesting. One of the top judges in this state. This is one of the leaders of the community. It's frightening. And he blamed everything on Dr. Spock. He said, Dr. Spock, And for all the kids, yep, that's Dr. Spock. So, do you realize that millions of people don't know Dr. Spock from Dr. Rock? That ain't, you can't reduce it to Dr. Spock. If it wasn't for Dr. Spock, he's pointing out, this is a judge, it would be the same way that it was in my day, when children were obedient, and children did this and respected their parents, but he started it. And he jumped on the Kennedy family. This is a judge for telling people that it's all right to protest. Basic American right, this is a judge. So they gave him license to do that. Look at what we got. He could point to, here's a man like who's, I would assume, he's supposed to understand the culture, what's going on, because he got to make judgments on human behavior, man. And he's reducing, things to simple things like Spock and John F. Kennedy and riots, and that's the way he sees it. You don't see any historical, social forces. Federal judge. That's very frightening. So he's scared of his 18-year-old daughter. That's what he said. It's frightening. I say, man, it's like you're another human being. And I think respect should be reciprocal. There's nothing. There's a difference between respect. I think when most people think respect, they tie it in with obedience. You just obey. I can respect you without acting the way they did in your day. He's very shaken up. And when you see people like that who are in control and who are supposed to be the good people and the right people, then it becomes you're very conscious of what the possibilities are in this country. But to him, there were no faults, that there have not been any mistakes on the part of the way things have been. You didn't say it in quite in those words, but I mean the implication of everything he said. It had been for this, and this, 2 or 3 things, and you wouldn't have any problems. I can accept that from a third grade gas station attendant. I can, but not a judge, man. It becomes very dangerous when he pronounces. People hear him, he's supporting all these things that people say. And he was, a judge, and we went into this thing about racism. I said, you're racist. No big deal. Most of us are. I'm race ridden. No big, no, I ain't a racist. I had a colored friend. That's it. I got 2 account basis records. I'm no racist. Man, no, man. We all are caught up in this thing, and you've got to understand, what it means. It's up to people like you to know how hard it is for you even to give fair assessments or give fair judgments on cases involving minority group people because of your racism, because it's a cultural phenomenon. It's very hard. Because first of all, you don't recognize his experience, the peculiarities of it, what the mentality, the mindset of certain people are. If they're not like yours, then you know something, they're asocial. Something wrong with them. And we don't even recognize. And I think people like judges and school teachers and anybody dealing with, like human behavior, trying to shape or to regulate human life, must understand differences, man. Must have an appreciation for culture. That distinction between culture and race, I think, is very important for people at this point in time. Because we don't make any distinction, you see. Although there is. We just don't make any distinction between culture and race. Most people in this position don't even acknowledge such a thing as cultural, like a black experience exists, separately from a white one. And it doesn't mean any more than that, in the sense, you can't moralize about it, it's just different. So, you can't, we tend to, when you start talking about differences, we start talking about, well, is it superior or is it inferior? No, I don't know how you're going to assess it. It's just different. You're different, like Chinese are different from Japanese, if you can understand that. They are the same racial make of people. They're totally different mindset, language, values, code of behavior, everything. It's totally two extremely different people. Why is that? If race determines, what people are all about, obviously it's culture. And we won't recognize that, Black people's culture has to be legitimately recognized for what it is, and dealt with for what it is. And I think that people like school teachers and whatnot, if they really want to talk about helping people to grow, this is where they ought to start, with helping people where they are, within their context. Because I happen to think learning is normal. I just think of a normal growth process for human beings, just learning things. You can't help from learning, And what is it that turns people off from learning? That's the question facing them. And you certainly can see it. I've worked with young children of all races. And I can notice, up until 6 or 7 years old, I noticed I worked about 3 summers with children of all races. And you see the inquisitiveness, the fantastical. You see them at the age of 11 years old, some of the children, man, you can't believe they're the same children. Just limitless energy and wanting, everything, a lot of what, why, when. This is what they got in their mind. And then they stop. Saying what, why. They stop when they get 10 years old, or 11, sometimes that young. Stop asking what, why, what's the use? Teacher knows everything. Teacher says, teacher this. But it's there. There's room for creativity. I hope one or two of you read this, and also watch the thing of that. I'm going to watch it myself. And I think this man has done a fairly good job in pointing out some things. I mean, just fantastical things that I didn't even begin to relate to here. The mythology, the whole thing about the chain of being, the continent of Africa, the mythology of racism grew up in English-speaking Europe 100 years before they made contact with Africans, before they ever got there. There were these stories. It was almost like an industry of people going around telling stories about the Africans with no heads, with eyes between their breasts. In their breasts, they didn't have just fantastical things. And it was big, and the knowledge that they did have, they suppressed that, the publishers, because the other business was so good. And then when they captured Alphazi, Leo Africanus, who was just as late as the 17th century, who told a lot of stories about it. He talked about its exotica, and he also talked about Timbuktu and the Sudan and all the great African civilizations. The only thing you know about Alphazi, Leo Africanus, who was adopted by Pope Leo, an African, and who was by Europeans who said to be the most knowledgeable man on Africa. They took his stories, exotic stories, and talked about the savagery and the cannibalism, and all these things that represented. That was in Europe before they made contact. You see, the mythology had already begun with the Africans. And even, the Europeans, like the Englishmen, I'm speaking primarily about English because there's a qualitative difference between the late relationships that Anglo-Saxons had with Africans and the Latinized people. There's like the whole relationship to Christianity was different. That always, from the beginning, the Catholic people had the missionary complex. That's why they enslaved people first. They had to save them from themselves, They couldn't be happy and civilized, without being and contented without being Christians. See, so they continued to Christianize all black people. But the English, the Protestant nation, didn't know what to do. It was a long time before they developed the rationale of religion. To say, well, the fact was already in existence. And they said, well, it's religion. You're heathens. You infidel. This is why we're doing this. And I think he does an outstanding job. So far, I haven't read all of it, about half of it. Talks about its development in the colonies, the legal development of racism, of people's attitudes being shaped. He pointed out how the whole thing of slavery in this country is an accident. It was, it's just an accident. The first slaves who came here, servants, I shouldn't say, they had no tradition of slavery here, in 1619 was an accident. And people were here almost a half century, black people, before they became what we call slaves. Half century. Based on temporary servitude or indentured servitude, which is the same thing that white people came over here under. Same thing. Generally from 7 to 10 years or 3 years, and if you're real young, you can be released when you're 21 years old, all kinds of people willingly sold themselves into indentured servitude. He talked about the three labor systems. So the wage system, which is the one we are most familiar with, and then in servitude, and how they evolved into racial slavery, the racial caste system for slavery. It just wasn't natural. All the reasons developed afterwards. And well, this is natural. And then you start, and in the 16th century is when the great bulk of the laws were written, slave laws. All of them. And by 1691, it was, almost understood that the people who were to be slaves were the children of African mothers, irrespective of who the father was. And so around this, this is a long experience. You have all of the institution shaping itself around slavery, the myth, the literature, and that's the legacy. That's what we've inherited. We can say the seeds of the same thing in our popular, at least black people can see it, entertainment, popular culture. Last week we talked about the cultural apparatus, and I pointed out some of the, the things that we grew up with in the movies. The black people look totally different to white people. This is just accepted. I mean, you find out that most of Amos and Andy and those kind of people were really only real in the minds of white people, because most folks didn't even know anybody like that. That's who, they were real things in white people's minds, and so they produced what they thought was real. You can still see that, shades of that. Despite, the thing that's going on television now. Every now and then you see a movie. I saw a movie the other night with the dead. This is one I grew up on too, with the dead end kids. They always had a black cat with them in the gang, and they were getting all kind of hellish things, But anytime they get in a dangerous fighting situation, the black cat ain't there. He comes up after the fighting's over. He always the first one to run when something happens. The first one to get scared. Same old symbols. You take such things like, one of the greatest, examples of racism that I can point to is World War I. Now, General Pershing is known as being a friend to black soldiers. They used to call him Black Ben or something like that, I guess because he... Black what? Black Jack, whatever it is. But see, you have to understand more about Pershing. Because Pershing is the general which sent the directives to France, which told France how to deal with black people and outlining social etiquette and this kind of thing. When I say racism, like there was a 369th, 370th, 371st, these are all black outfits, who fought in the French theater, and incidentally were the most decorated soldiers in World War I as a group. More than something. There's never been no movie made on the most decorated. They won 171 medals. First one that won the Croix de Guerre, that's equivalent to the Congressional Medal of Honor. Okay, they were like big heroes over there. This is where most of the black soldiers fought.